I'm live. I think I'm live. Okay, so hi everyone. It is Phoebe here doing a special reading this week for Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, and we will be doing chapter 6 as part of the Acid Left's ongoing Mark Fisher Capitalist Realism reading group. And then, because I've been wanting to get to it, we will also be doing a reading from Xerox and Xenogenesis that I thought would make a good pairing. Capitalism and Isophrenia, Ashpool, from Flatline Constructs. So grab your tea, grab your blanket, grab your pillow, get cozied up, get settled in, and let's go ahead and get involved. And just because I'm doing a new streaming setup, please feel free to let me know in the comments if there's something weird going on with my latency or recording or what have you. Okay, let's dig in. All that is solid melts into PR, market Stalinism and the bureaucratic anti-production. Mike Judge's unjustly under-celebrated film Office Space of 1999 is as acute an account of the 90s, early 2000s workplace as Schrader's Blue Collar was of 70s labor relations. Instead of the confrontation between trade union officials and management in a factory, Judge's film shows a corporation sclerosized by administratives anti-production. Workers receive multiple memos from different managers saying the exact same thing. Naturally, the memo concerns a bureaucratic practice. It aims to induce compliance with a new procedure of putting cover sheets on reports in keeping with the being smart ethos. The management style in Office Space is a mixture of shirt sleeves, informality, and quiet authoritarianism. Judge shows this same managerialism presides in the corporate coffee chains where the office workers go to relax. Here, staff are required to decorate their uniforms with 7 pieces of flair, i.e. badges or other personal tokens, to express their individuality and creativity. A handy illustration of the way in which creativity and self-expression have become intrinsic to labor and control societies, which, as Paulo Verno, Jan Moller-Breton, and other, definitely mispronounced Breton, as others have pointed out, now makes effective as well as productive demands on workers. Furthermore, the attempt to crudely quantify these effective contributions also tells us a great deal about the new arrangements. The flare example also points to another phenomenon, hidden expectations behind official standards. Is my stream working? Because it's showing a bunch of dropped frames in the preview. Hold on one moment. Please let me know is a reply to that comment if the stream is actually functioning, because right now it's showing like 3 frames per second on my end. Otherwise, I may have to restart and take this to YouTube because I hate Facebook Live. Joanna, a waitress at the coffee chain, wears exactly 7 pieces of flair, but it is made clear to her that even when those 7 is officially enough, it is actually inadequate. The manager asks if she wants to look like the sort of person who only does the bare minimum. You know what, Stan? If you want me to wear 37 pieces of flair, Joanna complains, Why don't you just make the minimum 37 pieces of flair? Well, the manager replies, I thought I remembered you saying that you wanted to express yourself. Enough is no longer enough. This syndrome will be familiar to many workers who may find that a satisfactory grading in a performance evaluation is no longer satisfactory. In many educational institutions, for instance, if after a classroom observation a teacher is graded as satisfactory, they will be required to undertake training prior to an assessment. Initially, it might appear to be a mystery that bureaucratic measures should have intensified under neoliberal governments that have presented themselves as anti-bureaucratic and anti-Stalinist. Yet, new kinds of bureaucracy, aims and objectives, outcomes, mission statements, etc., have proliferated even as neoliberal rhetoric about the end of top-down, centralized control has gained preeminence. It might seem that bureaucracy is a kind of return of the repressed, ironically re-emerging at the heart of a system which has professed to destroy it. But the resurgence of the bureaucracy in neoliberalism is more than an atavism or an anomaly. As I have already indicated, there is no contradiction between being smart and the increase of administration and regulation. They are two sides of labor in control societies. Richard Sennett has argued that the flattening of pyramidal hierarchies has actually led to more surveillance of workers. One of the claims made for the new organization of work is that it decentralizes power. That is, it gives people in the lower ranks of organization more control over their own activities, Sennett writes. Certainly, this claim is false in terms of the techniques employed for taking apart the old bureaucratic behemoths. The new information systems provide a comprehensive picture of the organization to top managers in ways which gives individuals anywhere in the network little room to hide. But it isn't only that. Information technology has granted managers more access to data. It is that the data itself has proliferated. Much of this information is provided by the workers themselves. Massimo De Angelis and David Harvey describe some of the bureaucratic measures in which a lecturer must comply when putting together a module for an undergraduate degree in British universities. For each module, De Angelis and Harvey write, the module leader, ML, i.e. lecturer, must complete various paperwork, in particular a module specification at the module start, which lists the module's aims and objectives, ILOs, modes and methods of assessment, amongst other information, and a module review document at the end of the module, in which the ML reports their own assessment of the module's strengths and weaknesses and their suggested changes for the following year, a summary of student feedback, average marks, and their dispersion. This is only the beginning, however. For the degree program as a whole, academics must prepare a program specification as well as producing an annual program reports, oh how corporatized academia, which records student performance according to progression rates, withdrawal rates, location, and spread of marks. All students' marks have to be graded against a matrix. Oh, how Boltronian. This auto-surveillance is completed by assessments carried out by external authorities. The marking of student assignments is monitored by external examiners who are supposed to maintain consistency of standards across the university sector. Lectures have to be observed by their peers, while departments are subject to periodic 3- or 4-day inspections by the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education, QAA. If they are research active, lecturers must submit their 4 best publications every 4 or 5 years to be graded by a panel as part of the research assessment exercise, replaced in 2008 by the equally controversial Research Excellence Framework. De Angelis and Harvey are clear that these are only very sketchy accounts of some of the bureaucratic tasks that academics have to perform, all of which have funding implications for institutions. This battery of bureaucratic procedures is by no means confined to universities, nor to education. other public services, such as the National Health Service and the police force, find themselves enmeshed in similar bureaucratic metastases. This is in part a consequence of the inherent resistance of certain processes and services to marketization. The supposed marketization of education, for instance, rests on a confused and underdeveloped analogy. Are students the consumers of the service or its product? No Child Left Behind here in America would have some things to say about that. The idealized market was supposed to deliver friction-free exchanges in which the desires of consumers would be met directly, without the need for intervention or mediation by regulatory agencies. Yet the drive to assess the performance of workers and to measure the forms of labor, which by their nature are resistant to quantification, has inevitably required additional layers of management and bureaucracy. What we have is not a direct comparison of workers' performance or output, but a comparison between the audited representation of that performance and output. Inevitably, a short-circuiting occurs, and work becomes geared towards generation and massaging of representations rather than to the official goals of the work itself. Indeed, an anthropological study of local government in Britain argues that more effort goes into ensuring that a local authority services are represented correctly than actually goes into actually approving those services. Approving works too. This reversal of priorities is one of the hallmarks of a system which can be characterized without hyperbole as market Stalinism. What late capitalism repeats from Stalinism is just this valuing of symbols of achievement over actual achievement. As Marshall Berman explained, describing Stalin's White Sea Canal project of 1931 to 33, Stalin seems to have been so intent on creating a highly visible symbol of development that he pushed and squeezed the project in ways that only retarded the development of the project. Thus, the workers and the engineers were never allowed the time, money, or equipment necessary to build a canal that would be deep enough and safe enough to carry 20th century cargoes. Consequently, the canal has never played any significant role in Soviet commerce or industry. All the canal could support, apparently, were tourist steamers, which in the 1930s were abundantly stocked with Soviet and foreign writers who obligingly proclaimed the glories of the work. The canal was a triumph of publicity, but if half the care that went into the public relations campaign had been devoted to the work itself, there would have been far fewer victims and far more real developments, and the project would have been a genuine tragedy rather than a brutal farce in which real people were killed by pseudo-events. In a strange compulsion to repeat, the ostensibly anti-Stalinist, neoliberal New Labour government has shown the same tendency to implement initiatives in which real-world effects matter only insofar as they register at the level of PR appearance. The notorious targets of which the New Labour government was so enthusiastic in imposing are a case in point. In a process that repeats itself with iron predictability everywhere that they are installed, targets quickly cease to be a way of measuring performance and become ends in themselves. Anxiety about falling standards in school examinations is now a regular feature of the summertime in Britain. No Child Left Behind. Yet, if students are less skilled and knowledgeable than their predecessors, this is due not to a decline in the quality of examinations per se, but to the fact that all of the teaching is geared towards passing of the exams. Narrowly focused exam drill replaces a wider engagement with subjects. Similarly, hospitals perform many routine procedures instead of a few serious urgent operations because this allows them to hit the targets that they are assessed on, operating rates, success rates, and reduction in waiting time, etc., all more effectively. It would be a mistake to regard this market Stalinism as some deviation from the true spirit of capitalism. On the contrary, it would be better to say that an essential dimension of Stalinism was inhibited by its association with a social project like socialism, and can only emerge in a late capitalist culture in which images require an autonomous force. The way value is generated on the stock exchange depends on, of course, less than on what a company really does and more the perceptions of it, and the beliefs about its future performance. In capitalism, that is to say, all that is solid melts into PR, and late capitalism is defined at least as much by this ubiquitous tendency towards PR production as it is by the imposition of market mechanisms. Here, oh my gosh, wow, I'm really gonna out myself as a suit here. I know Slavoj Žižek. I'm pretty sure that's pronounced Žižek. That feel when you read about someone's name on the internet thousands of times but never actually learn how to properly pronounce it. Mood. Here, Žižek's elaboration of Lacan... Damn it, not again! Lacan's concept of the big other is crucial. The big other is the collective fiction, the symbolic structure presupposed by any social field. The big other can never be encountered in itself. Instead, we can only ever confront its stand-ins. These representatives are by no means always leaders. In the example of the White Sea Canal above, for instance, it wasn't Stalin himself who was the representation of the big other, so much as the Soviet and foreign writers who had to be persuaded of the glories of the project. I'm sorry, I just immediately thought of the Hotel Pyongyang. God bless them. Everyone. One important dimension of the big other is that it does not know everything. It is this constitutive ignorance of the big other that allows public relations to function. Indeed, the big other could be defined as the consumer of PR and propaganda, the virtual figure which is required to believe even when no individual can. To use one of Zizek's examples, who was it, for instance, that didn't know that, this is one of his fun acronyms, really existing socialism, RES, was shabby and corrupt? Not any of the people who were all too aware of its shortcomings, nor any of the government administrators who couldn't but know. No, it was the big other who was the one deemed not to know, who wasn't allowed to know. The quotidian reality of RES. Yet the distinction between what the big other knows, i.e. what is officially accepted, and what is widely known and experienced by actual individuals is very far from being merely emptily formal. It is the discrepancy between the two that allows ordinary social reality to function. When the illusion that the big other did not know can no longer be maintained, the incorporeal fabric holding the social system together disintegrates. This is why Khrushchev's speech in 1965, in which he admitted one of the reasons I love Fisher so much is that I too am a rabid abuser of air quotes, both intentionally in the very quoting way and the abusive mocking way. Anyway, back to Khrushchev. Pronounce that correctly. Khrushchev's speech in 1965, in which he admitted the failings of the Soviet state, was so momentous. It is not as if anyone in the party was unaware of the atrocities and corruption carried out in its name, but rather that Khrushchev's big announcement had made it impossible to believe any more that the big other was ignorant of them. So much for really existing socialism. But what of really existing capitalism? One way to understand the realism of capitalist realism is in terms of the claim to have given up belief in the big other. Postmodernism can be construed as the name for the complex of crises that the decline in the belief in the big other has triggered, as Lyotard's famous formulation of the postmodern condition, incredulity towards, I think that's how one pronounces incredulity. Credulity? Towards meta-narratives. I'm just going to roll with that, suggests. Jameson, of course, would argue that the incredulity towards meta-narratives is one expression of the cultural logic of late capitalism, a consequence of the switch into post-Fordist modes of capital accumulation. Nick Land gives one of the most euphoric accounts of the postmodern meltdown of culture into the economy. In Land's work, a cybernetically upgraded invisible hand is progressively eliminating centralized state power. This is what I kind of do all my living and work on the floor, so forgive me for adjusting. Land's 90s text synthesized cybernetics, complexity theory, cyberpunk fiction, and neoliberalism to construct a vision of capital planetary artificial intelligence, a vast, supple, endlessly fissile system which renders human will obsolete. In his manifesto for nonlinear decentered capital, Meltdown, Land evokes a massively distributed matrix network tendency oriented to disabling ROM command control programs, sustaining all macro and micro governmental entities globally concentrating themselves as the human security system. This capitalism is a shattering reel in which viral and digital signals circulate on self-sustaining networks which bypass the symbolic and therefore do not require the big other as guarantor. It is Deleuze and Guattari's capital as unnameable thing, but without the forces of reterritorialization and anti-production, which they argued were constitutive of capitalism. One of the problems of Land's position is also that what is most interesting about it, precisely that it posits a pure capitalism, a capitalism which is only inhibited and blocked by extrinsic rather than internal elements. According to Land's logic, these elements are atavisms that will eventually be consumed and metabolized by capital. Yet, capitalism cannot be purified in this way. Don't we all know it? Oh, Dylan, thank you. Please don't fall asleep. I give you permission to fall asleep if you'd like to, but you should really ride this out with me. Yet, capitalism cannot be purified in this way. Strip away the forces of anti-production and capitalism disappears within them. Similarly, there is no progressive tendency towards an unsheathing of capitalism. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I think I ate something I have a mild allergy to earlier. My nose is kind of itching. Yes, I scratched my nose like a rabbit. Anyway, where were we? Oh, Ramiz. Well, hey. At least you got introduced to Mark Fisher, right? Yeah, I'm just reading. So I'll take a quick pause here, and for anyone following along, I'm about 3/4 way down, page 46. Camera's up there. So this is actually a video. This video specifically is part of the collaboration with the Acid Left. He is doing a reading discussion series on capitalist realism, and what I do specifically is I just read to people. I'm an amateur audiobook-ish theory narrator on YouTube, and I also have a series in Philbook, a group here on Weird Facebook called The Cozy Corner, where I literally just read to people. I love reading to people, and I think some people just really love being read to, and especially with something like capitalist realism, and just Mark Fisher's work and the CCRU's work in general, and just philosophy in general, it's really important to me to make it accessible. And that is one of the reasons I do this, because not everyone necessarily has the time to sit down and read, or if they have a learning disability like I do, sometimes really dense or chaotic texts can be very intimidating to sit down and read alone. So I like to kind of provide a jumping in point. Yes. Back to capitalist realism. Where were we? I like having the book in the frame. Here we go. Similarly, there is no progressive tendency towards an unsheathing of capitalism, no gradual unmasking of capital as it really is, rapacious, indifferent, and inhuman. On the contrary, the essential role of the incorporeal transformations effectuated by PR, branding, and advertising in capitalism suggests that, in order to operate effectively, capitalism's rapacity, I think that's how you pronounce rapacity, depends upon various forms of sheathing. Really existing capitalism, and for anyone following along, I love the way he does this. He does it in the German capitalized ideal way. So capital R, capital E, capital C, really existing capitalism, is marked by the same division which characterized really existing socialism between, on the one hand, an official culture in which capitalist enterprises are presented as socially responsible and caring, and on the other, a widespread awareness that companies are actually corrupt, ruthless, and etc. In other words, capitalist postmodernity is not quite as incredulous as it would appear to be, as the jeweler Gerald Ratner famously found to his cost. Ratner precisely tried to circumvent the symbolic and tell it how it is, describing his inexpensive jewelry his shop sold as crap in an after-dinner speech. But the consequence of Ratner making this judgment official were immediate and serious. $500 million was wiped off the value of the company, and he lost his job. Customers might previously have known that the jewelry the Ratner sold was poor quality, but the big other didn't know, and as soon as it did, Ratner's collapsed. Vernacular postmodernism has dealt with the crisis of symbolic efficiency in a far less intense way than Nick Land, though metafictional anxiety is about the function of the author, and in television programs or films which expose the mechanisms of their own productions and reflexively incorporate discussions of their own status as commodities. But postmodernism's supposed gestures of demystification do not evince sophistication so much as a certain naivete, a conviction that there were others in the past who really believed in the symbolic. Soothes. Zizek gives an example of a judge. I know very well things are the way I see them, that this person is a corrupted weakling, but I nevertheless treat him respectfully since he wears the insignia of a judge, so that when he speaks it is the law itself which speaks through him. However, postmodernism's cynical reduction to reality falls short when a judge speaks. There is, in a way, more truth in his words, the words of the institution of law, than in the direct reality of the person, of judge. If one limits oneself to what one sees, one simply misses the point. I read these people. Lacan. I read them, I swear. Real suit hours here. Lacan, oh my god. Lacan aims his paradox with his les non-observantes, those who do not allow themselves to be caught in the symbolic deception fiction, who continue to believe their eyes are the ones who err most. A cynic who believes only in his eyes misses the efficiency of the symbolic fiction and how it structures our experience of reality. Much of Baudrillard's work was a commentary on the same effect, the way in which the abolition of the symbolic led not to the direct encounter with the real, but to a kind of hemorrhaging of the real. For Baudrillard, phenomena such as the fly-on-the-wall documentaries and political opinion polls, both of which claim to present reality in an unmediated way, would always pose an insoluble dilemma. Gee gosh, I definitely, as an American, during the 2020 election, big notes here, did the presence of the cameras affect the behavior of those being filmed? Would the publication of poll results affect the future behavior of voters? Such questions were undecidable, and therefore reality would always be elusive. The very moment, oh my gosh, yeah, this draws a very important... I know you shouldn't talk about Foucault and Baudrillard like in the same breath in this way, but there's so much to be said about the surveillance within the hyperreal. Let me get comfortable. There we go. One day I'll figure out the better mic setup. Such questions were undecidable, and therefore reality would always be elusive. At the very moment when it seemed that it was being grasped in the raw, reality transformed into what Baudrillard, in a much understood neologism, called hyperreality. Uncannily echoing Baudrillard's fixation, the most successful reality television programs ending up fusing fly-on-the-wall documentary elements with interactive polling. In effect, there are two levels of reality in these shows. Paris Hilton as a hyper-real object. Note to self. The unscripted behavior of the real-life participants on the screen, and the unpredictable responses of the audience at home, which in turn affect the behavior of the on-screen participants. Thank you, Ramiz. Lacoon. One day I'll get it. One day I'll get there. Yeah, part of this is, for complete disclosure purposes, I do have a mild speech impediment. I mentioned my learning disability a few minutes ago, but the speech impediment is definitely... It's on a roll tonight, guys. Yet, reality TV is continually haunted by questions about fiction and delusion. Are the participants acting, suppressing certain aspects of their personality in order to appear more appealing to us, the audience? And have the audience's votes been accurately registered, or is there some kind of fix? The slogan that the Big Brother TV show uses, "You Decide," perfectly captures the mode of control by feedback that, according to Baudrillard, has replaced old centralized forms of power. Unfortunately, and I didn't pick this up my first read, but I think something that Fisher, maybe this could be a topic for the reading discussion, but obviously we know we have a bit more context for how reality TV functions on a production level, but the scripted, the behavior, the acting, all of that is in itself a thing of production, you know? I may be thinking of America's Next Top Model here. The slogan that the Big Brother TV show uses, "You Decide," captures perfectly the mode of control by feedback that, according to Baudrillard, has replaced old centralized forms of power. We ourselves occupy the empty seat of power, phoning and clicking in our responses. TV's Big Brother has superseded Orwell's Big Brother. Oh, that's a big brain sentiment right there. You should read in whatever language you are proficient in, if only because it helps you bolster that language. Because you'll be able to understand that language at some point anyway, hopefully. We, the audience, are not subjected to a power that comes from outside. Rather, we are integrated into a control circuit that has our desires and preferences as its only mandate. But those desires and preferences are returned to us, no longer as ours, but as the desires of the big other. Clearly, these circuits are not confined to television. Cybernetic feedback systems, focus groups, demographic surveys are now integral to the delivery of all services, including education and government. This returns us to the issue of post-Fordist bureaucracy. There is, of course, a close relationship between bureaucracy, the discourse of officialdom, and the big other. Witness two of Zizek's own examples of the big other at work. A low-level official who, having not been informed of the promotion, says, "Sorry, I have not yet been properly informed about this new measure, so I can't help you." A woman who believed that she was suffering bad luck because the number of her house who could not be satisfied by simply repainting a different number herself because it has to be done properly by the responsible state institution. We are all familiar with bureaucratic libido, with the enjoyment that certain officials derive from this position of disavowed responsibility. "It's not me, I'm afraid, it's the regulations." The frustration of dealing with bureaucrats often arises because they themselves can make no decisions. Rather, they are permitted only to refer to decisions that have already been made by the big other. Kafka was the greatest writer on bureaucracy because he saw that this structure of disavowal was inherent to bureaucracy. The quest to reach the ultimate authority who will finally resolve K's official status can never end because the big other cannot be encountered in itself. There are only officials, more or less hostile, engaged in acts of interpretation about the big other's intentions. And these acts of interpretation, these referrals of responsibility, are all that the big other is. Red tape labyrinths. Oh, may we all be Asterion these days. If Kafka is valuable as a commentator on totalitarianism, it is by revealing that there is a dimension of totalitarianism which cannot be understood on the level of despotic command. Kafka's Kafka's purgatorial vision of a bureaucratic labyrinth without end chimes with Zizek's claim that the Soviet system was an empire of signs in which even the nomenclatura themselves, including Stalin and Molotov, were engaged in interpreting a complex series of social semiotic signals. No one knew what was required. Instead, individuals can only guess what particular gestures or directives meant. What happens in late capitalism when there is no possibility of appealing, even in principle, to a final authority which can offer the definitive official version is a massive intensification of that ambiguity. As an example of this syndrome, let us turn once more to further education. At the meeting between trade union officials, college principals, and members of parliament, the Learning and Skills Council, the quango at the heart of the FE funding labyrinth, came in for a particular attack. Neither the teachers nor the principals nor the MPs could determine how particular directives had generated themselves, since they are not there in government policy itself. That hyperreal object that it may be. That's not Fisher, that's me. It's all fake news. The answer was that the LSC interpreted the instructions issued by the Department for Education and Skills. These interpretations then achieved the strange autonomy peculiar to bureaucracy. On the one hand, bureaucratic procedures flowed freely, independent of any external authority, but that very autonomy means that they assume a heavy implacability, a resistance to any amendment or questioning. The proliferation of auditing culture in post-Fordism indicates that the demise of the big other has been exaggerated. Auditing can perhaps be conceived as a fusion of PR and bureaucracy, because the bureaucratic data is usually intended to fulfill a promotional role. In the case of education, for example, exam results or research ratings augment or diminish, as we academics know, the prestige of particular institutions. Oh my gosh, what did they eat? The frustration for the teacher is that it seems as if their work is increasingly aimed at oppressing the big other which is collating and consuming this data. Data has been put on inverted commas here because much of this so-called information has little meaning or application outside of the parameters of the audit. As Eva Berglund puts it, the information that audit creates does have consequences, even though it is so shorn of local detail, so abstract, as to be misleading or meaningless, except, that is, by the aesthetic criteria of the audit itself. New bureaucracy takes the form not of a specific, delimited function performed by particular workers, but invades all areas of work, with the result that, as Kafka prophesied, workers become their own auditors, forced to assess their own performance. Take, for example, the new system that Ofsted, Office for Standards in Education, used to inspect further education colleges. Under the old system, a college would have a heavy inspection once every 4 years or so, i.e. one involving many lesson observations and a large number of inspectors present in the college. Under the new, improved system, if a college can demonstrate that its internal assessment systems are effective, it would only have to undergo a light inspection. But the downside of this light inspection is obvious. Surveillance and monitoring are outsourced from Ofsted to the college and ultimately to the lecturers themselves, become a permanent feature of the college structure and the psychology of the individual lecturers. The difference between the old heavy and the new light inspection systems corresponds precisely to Kafka's distinction between the ostensible acquittal and indefinite postponement outlined above. With ostensible acquittal, you petition the lower court judges until they grant you a non-binding reprieve. You are then free from the court until the time when your case is reopened. Indefinite postponement, meanwhile, keeps your case at the lowest level of the court, but at the cost of an anxiety that never ends. The changes in Ofsted inspections are mirrored in the change from the research assessment exercise to the research excellence framework in higher education. Periodic assessment will be superseded by a permanent and ubiquitous measurement which cannot help but generate the same perpetual anxiety. In any case, it is not as if the light inspection is in any sense preferable for staff than the heavy one. The inspectors are in the college for the same amount of time as they were under the old system. The fact that there are fewer of them does nothing to alleviate the stress of the inspection, which has far more to do with the extra bureaucratic window dressing as one has to do in anticipation of a possible observation than it has anything to do with the actual observation itself. The inspection, that is to say, corresponds precisely to Foucault's account of the virtual nature of surveillance and discipline and punish. Foucault famously observes that there is no need for the place of surveillance to actually be occupied. The effect of not knowing whether you will be observed or not produces an introjection of the surveillance apparatus. You constantly act as if you are always about to be observed. Yet, in the case of school and university inspections, what you will be graded on is not primarily your abilities as a teacher, so much as your diligence as a bureaucrat. There are other bizarre effects. Since Ofsted is now observing the college's self-assessment systems, there is an implicit incentive for the college to grade itself and its teaching lower than it actually deserves. The result is a kind of postmodern capitalist version of Maoist confessionalism, in which workers are required to engage in constant symbolic self-denigration. At one point, when our line manager was extolling the virtues of the new light inspection system, he told us that the problem with our departmental logbooks was that they were not sufficiently self-critical. But don't worry, he urged. Any self-criticisms we make are purely symbolic and will never be acted upon, as if performing self-flagellation is part of a purely formal exercise in cynical bureaucratic compliance were any less demoralizing. In the post-Fordist classroom, the reflexive impotence of the students is mirrored by reflexive impotence of the teachers. DeAngelis and Harvey report that practices and requirements of standardization and surveillance obviously impose a huge burden of work on academics, and few are happy about it. There has been a number of responses. Managers have frequently suggested that there is no alternative, and have perhaps suggested that what we need to do is work smarter, not harder. How very Office Space. This seductive slogan introduced to dampen staff resistance to further change, which in our experience has a devastating effect on working conditions, attempts to couple the need for change, i.e. restructuring and innovation, in order to meet the budget pressure and increase competitiveness with staff's resistance not only to the worsening of the condition of their work, but also to the educational and academic meaninglessness of the changes. The invocation of the idea that there is no alternative and the recommendation to work smarter, not harder, shows how capitalist realism sets the tone for labor disputes in post-Fordism. Ending the inspection regime, one lecturer sardonically remarked, seems more impossible than ending slavery was. Such fatalism can only be challenged if a new collective political subject emerges. And that was Chapter 6 of Capitalist Realism. So next week, around the same time, I'm going to be doing Chapter 7. Again, this is in collaboration with the Acid Left. Now, I'm going to take a quick break. Before we dig into, let me see. There we go. Now, my goal is at some point to do a full read of, so to do every essay in Flatline Constructs in this group. I've been a bit spotty-dotty about it in terms of timing and everything, but this week I thought it would be a nice companion to to the big other in the PR machine if we looked at Capitalism and Isophrenia, Ashpool. Make it cozy. For the record, this isn't an alcoholic drink. This isn't, what does it look like? Hypnotic, whatever. It's just blue raspberry Kool-Aid. I'm an adult. I actually don't drink, so. Okay. Mark Fisher, Flatline Constructs, section Xerox and Xenogenesis, specifically his essay, Capitalism and Isophrenia, Ashpool. Ashpool. We cause the brain to become allergic to certain of its own neurotransmitters, resulting in a particularly pliable imitation of autism. Called out. I understand that the effect is more easily obtained with an embedded microchip. Baudrillard increasingly poses himself as the melancholy observer of a techno-organic tendency towards self-preservation, a tendency that is bound to go badly wrong, where the self, as that being clung on to, is destined to implode into a figure that haunts Baudrillard's later writing, autism. For the record, I am autistic, just so you know. So I feel like I can riff on this in a holistic way. Our monsters, writes Baudrillard, are all manic autists. Ashpool, the mysterious cryozombie patriarch of Gibson's Neuromancer, is an exemplary case of what lies at the illusion of the end of the melancholy line of entropic sameness which Baudrillard's work tracks, a blind drive toward self-preservation that ends up in a suicidal line of abolition. What Baudrillard in The Illusion of the End calls identitary, ipsomaniacal, isophrenic madness, merging in the delirium of genetic confusion, of the scrambling of codes and networks, of biological... Oh, I'm sorry, itch. Of biological molecular anomalies of autism. Ashpool stands as a recent example of a particular type belonging to what we have called negativized Gothic, figures like Victor Frankenstein who, in their very desire to ward off death, produce it in new simulated forms. Ashpool not only preemptively freezes his body in an odd necrotic attempt to ward off death and perpetuate his identity, he also clones his daughters, whom he sleeps with. This attempt to preserve identity thus devolves into the implosive direction of incest and autism. The Tessier Ashpool home, or extended body, Villa Straylight, is built as a kind of autistic shrine closed off from the outside world, recycling itself through its own incestuous technologies. They built Freeside to tap the wealth of the new islands, grew rich and eccentric, and began the construction of an extended body in Straylight. We sealed ourselves away behind our money, growing inward, generating a seamless universe of the self. Neuromancer 207. We begin to burrow into ourselves. Neuromancer 271. Unlike the sinister man-made Everest of the Tyrell Corporation, Villa Straylight is not an erectile structure towering above the city, but a Gothic folly, whose semiotics bespeak a turning in and denial of the bright void beyond the hull. Villa Straylight, the hypermodern equivalent of the Citizen Kane's Xanadu, is a mausoleum cum preservation chamber cum nest, a technologically protected interiority. This Escher-esque structure, an endless series of chambers linked by passages, by stairwells vaulting like intestines, a disparate proliferation of structures, forms flowing, interlocking, rising towards a solid core of microcircuitry. Our clan's corporate heart, a cylinder of silicon, wormholed with narrow maintenance tunnels. Neuromancer 206. Yeah. Is a body grown in upon itself, which, although designed as a prophylaxis against schizophrenia, serves only ultimately to incubate its own form of madness. Tessier Ashpool's crionization and turning in upon itself is an attempt to escape the general trend towards anonymization and corporate power. But as the image Wintermute feeds Case from his dreams, a wasp swarm edited to include the TA logo shows the Tessier Ashpool's technologically perpetuated filial line is ultimately compelled into becoming a swarm becoming of which, more below, see Winter Mutation. Neuromancer is a sorcerer's narrative. Despite his best efforts, the outside, Ashpool glumly observes, gets in. We encounter Ashpool only briefly, as he is in fact arranging his own death. In the off-world satellite of Villa Straylight, Molly Millions meets Ashpool executing the final move in what is, in effect, an elaborately organized suicide. She crossed the room to Ashpool's chair. The man's breathing was slow and ragged. She peered at the litter of drugs and alcohol. She put his pistol down, picked up her Fletcher, dialed the barrel over to a single shot, and carefully put a toxin dart through the center of his closed left eyelid. He jerked once, breath halting in mid-intake. His other eye, brown and fathomless, opened slowly. Neuromancer 223. Reflecting on this scene, which he has witnessed via his SimStim link with Molly, what Case feels above all is a sense of surprise. Accustomed to the faceless impersonality of the multinationals, Case is puzzled by the very persistence of Ashpool's humanity. It seems to Case that he'd never really thought of anyone like Ashpool, anyone as powerful as he imagined Ashpool had been as human. Case had always been taken it for granted that the real bosses, the kingpins in a given industry, would be both more and less than people. He'd always imagined it as a gradual and willing accommodation to the machine, the system, the parent organism. Neuromancer 242, 243. The despotic dynastic nature of Ashpool's power bewilders Case. Power in Case's world meant corporate power. Neuromancer 242. Yet Ashpool's humanity is only an expensively produced simulation dependent upon cryonic freezing in tanks which he periodically immerses his body. Ashpool is a strange kind of technicized zombie, not an organism at all, just as, in a certain sense, the Zaibatsus, massive multinational companies which dominate Gibson's world and ours, have achieved a simulated organicism. The multinationals, Case muses, cannot be adequately comprehended in terms of old boundaries, whether national or ontological. Neuromancer 242. The Zaibatsus, the multinationals that shaped the course of human history, had transcended old barriers. Viewed as organisms, they had attained a kind of immortality. The corporation is a meta-organic control system in which particular human beings operate as replicable parts. You couldn't kill a Zaibatsu by assassinating a dozen key executives. There were others waiting to step up the ladder, assume the vacated position, access the vast banks of corporate memory. Neuromancer 242. They are hives with cybernetic memories of vast single organisms, their DNA coded in silicon. But Tessier Ashpool wasn't like that. TA was an atavism, a clan. Also 242. I'll figure out a better way to do the embedded quotes in the future. Tessier Ashpool's dynasty dates from a period prior to the mid-21st century Japanese global hegemony, Gibson projects, a period perhaps even preceding the American-dominated 20th century. Neuromancer 220. I'm old, Ashpool tells Molly, over 200 years if you count the cold. Tessier Ashpool preserves archaic power by mummifying it, just as Ashpool freezes his own body in cryonic tanks. They withdraw from the market and live off their massive accumulation, retreating from the risks of hyper-late capitalism into the parasitic structure of illustralite. In Ashpool, what Baudrillard calls the immense modern enterprise of staving off death, the ethics of accumulation and material production, sacralization through investment, the labor and profit collectively called the spirit of capitalism, finds its techno-erotic consummation. Here, the individual's anguish of death, arising, according to Baudrillard, out of the reciprocally, oh my god, I know how to say that word, reciprocally, I suddenly forgot how to pronounce a very 101 word. Reciprocally, symbiotic, let's use that. Arising according to Baudrillard out of the symbiotically inter-exciting emergence of Protestant, oh my god. What is going on with my brain? Protestantism and capitalism, which, by the way, if that's a thing that interests you, you should absolutely look at Max Weber's work on the Protestant ethic. It's very foundational to, Baudrillard may not accept it like that, but it's very foundational to current capitalism as it is intertwined with Christological frameworks of labor and so on and so forth in the West. Inter-exciting emergence of I'm a comparative religions scholar, oh my god. Of Protestantism and capitalism emerges as a process whereby time as value is accumulated in the phantasm of death deferred, pending the term of a linear infinity of value. The identity of capital passes into the infinity of time, the irreversibility of quantitative growth. Producing his own salvation machine from cryogenic freezing tanks, Ashpool homeopathically absorbs death, attempting to trade external extinction for small doses of troubled sleep. He hopes to reverse the formula. Life is accumulation, death is due payment. aiming to offer his accumulated wealth as payment for perpetually extended life. Ashpool's very desire to preserve human individuality violates crazily what, in terms of the illusion of the end, would be a degeneration back into the subhuman, the replicative. Baudrillard, are we not going back, as a result of all of our technologies, to a clonal, metastatic, de facto eternity, which was formerly the destiny of the inhuman? And that was the brief essay, Capitalism and Isophrenia, Ashpool, from Mark Fisher's Flatline Constructs, Gothic Materialism, and Cybernetic Theory Fiction. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I really hope you enjoyed, especially if you are here as part of the wider Acid Left reading group, and if you're not, you absolutely should be. Talking out these types of texts, talking out these theories, especially in current context, is so much more necessary than ever. We need each other these days. And again, thank you for joining me. I wonder, what's tonight's sign-off gonna be? Okay, so super quickly, I hate Facebook Live so much. I had a super cute sign-off this week, and the weird streaming latency thing killed it. So, postscript, signing off from your Mark Fisherian, anti-capitalist, Gothic materialist, cybernetic spiritualist, doomer GF. Good night, and good evening.